I run a garage down here in Transfer, Pennsylvania, and my connection with the Army camp here was, back in the 40s when they first started to build it, before the troops was ever here. I drove slag truck out of Cambria Slag in Sharpsville. From there to the Army camp, there was roughly 300 trucks running continuous. And we built all the roads. I'm saying we started down at, I think it was Edgewood Drive we started building, and we worked clear down to the bottom, and then we built what they first called A, B, and C Street, which is now Arlington, Brentwood, and Crestview. The streets in between wasn't numbered. And then after we got all them built, that took almost about a year. Then after that, we hauled up the Arsenal in Meadville, and from there I went into the service. And after I got my basic training and all my ordnance training, I was transferred up here to the Army camp for 13 weeks. And things got a little bored, so we just took on a project of watering lawns and stuff up here, just for something to do. And after that, 13 weeks there, I went down to Texas. Before an ordnance outfit and went overseas. Well, when I come back home, this in 1991, I got with the, started going to the Vets Club pretty regular. I joined it way back in '63 when they first started, and started going up there, and I've been the commander now. This is 90, I'm going into 93, 94, and I've been commander of the club for the last 3 years.
Oh yeah. And that's right across from the...
That is part of the old Army campgrounds, what they called camp, well, it used to be Camp Shenango, and then they named it after a general by the name of Reynolds later on. And then it was known as Camp Reynolds. It still is. Well, Reynolds Development, Reynolds School, and all that stuff it's all Reynolds now, named after the camp. And the house I live in is the room adjoining this one. To the front of the building used to be the old post office building where the Army mail come in, and it used to be a store. They had a gas pump outside. Across the street used to be the old Seidel Chevrolet dealership.
And I feel that I'm the second girl hired at the old Army camp. And I worked for Mellon Stewart Company, general contractor, transfer PA. And I was kind of lucky to find some of this stuff because I moved and threw so much out. But I'm going to read this part of it. This is a letter of recommendation to my husband. It's dated May the 13th, 1943, at which time he was working at the Greenville Steel Car in Greenville. But it's from the office manager of the Mellon Stewart Company. And it says, to whom it may concern. Mr. William Hawks has been employed by us as employment manager and labor relations man during the life of this job. Mr. Hawks installed here the entire system of employment records, identification, termination, and so forth, to handle a labor turnover of 16,500 men in 10 months. And I have his original badges that he wore.
Those are the ones that he wore when he was working.
When he worked, yes. And here's his little card they gave everyone. He set up all the chairs and desks. And as each man came in, he was first talked to by an interviewer as to what kind of work he was looking for, what he could do. Then he was turned to a typist who typed his application, and then he bought a bond. That was the next thing. No one
really?
ever refused a war bond. No one ever refused. I mean, this bond would come out of his pay. And then he got a physical examination by a Dr. Elder. He was either from Mercer or Sharon, I don't remember which. And then he had his picture taken. And then he was sent to, there was a man there to take him to the department where he was going to go to work.
Oh.
And, oh, I forgot. He joined the union. Either the carpenters or the laborers union.
Oh, really? So it's just like,
And as I remember, the carpenters union was $5 and the labor union was $5 and the carpenter was 10.
I came to Camp Reynolds in 1942 before it was activated as a replacement depot. It was still under construction when I came here, and I was contacted to come in and activate the exchanges when the replacement would be coming into the camp. And I spent about 3 months at least getting ready in exchanges for these replacements. And we would get notification after the replacements started. We would get notification that so many were coming in, and they would come in on the spur down at the lower end of the camp. And it was my job to see that there was a post exchange in operation for them by the time they got here. And we never failed. We always had an exchange open at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I had a group of carpenters, and we had always had excess help in the exchanges so that we could get the merchandise in, get the shelving and the counters all set up. And then we had excess help in exchanges, which we would bring down to the new exchanges so that we would have it open in the afternoon. And over a period of time, the headquarters, not that they gave me credit, but they gave the exchange officer a commendation for having opened the exchanges so quickly on such short notice.
How about the race riot? Do you remember that, Daddy?
Oh yeah, I remember the race riot. I was on duty in the main exchange office that night, and the exchange officer called me and told me that he had a call that there was trouble down in the colored exchanges. So he got me, and we both got in the car and drove down. We got down almost down to the colored area when the MPs stopped us and said, "Don't go any further because they're shooting." And when we jumped out of the car, we could hear the bullets and hear the rifles being shot. And we made a dive for a barracks, and the exchange officer got a window open and gave me a boost and pushed me through the window. And I went in on the floor of the post exchange, or the barracks, and we laid on the floor behind a space heater. And even then we could hear the bullets going over our heads as we laid on the floor.
Do you remember what started the race riot, Daddy?
Oh yeah, the race riot was started, at that time the armed forces were segregated, and the colored were dissatisfied with the arrangements they had made for them, and they decided they were going to frequent the white exchanges. And when they did, then the fight started. And after the fight started, then a group of colored or black soldiers went up and broke into a headquarters and broke in, got M1 rifles. To my recollection, I think they got about 16 rifles. And then they started, when they got outside, they got rifles and ammunition, and they started firing up the hill into the white area. But it didn't last too long. It probably lasted about an hour when they were able to get it under control.
Then what they do after that? Do you remember what they did for the black soldiers and after the race riot?
After that, then the United States put up a rec hall for them, movie theater, and a big recreation building. And I remember that some of the Louis Armstrong was one of the big attractions that they got in for the colored people. I was there and listened to Louis Armstrong play.
Now, where would this be at?
Would be down at the lower end of the depot.
The lower end of the depot. Could you remember what street? A Street, B Street, or one of the side streets?
Oh, it was on one of the main streets, probably the end of A Street, probably.
Yeah. Today we call this Arlington Drive. We call it Arlington Drive
Well,
today.
it's down at about that end of it was where it was.
Do you remember any of the other black artists that came?
Anyway,
Any of the other black entertainers?
No. Or any? Do
No.
you remember any other ones?
the biggest one that came was Louis Armstrong. And that's the only one I remember, but I remember Cab Calloway and Duke Ellington, was it?
Mhm.
They came too at different times.
Did you get to see them then, or just know that they were here?
I just knew they were here. I got to see Louis Armstrong.
Do you remember when the soldiers would leave, what would happen?
Oh. Well, every day when we had a shipment of troops going out, they would march down the main street, which was, what was it, A Street? Would march down A Street down to the spur where the troop train would be waiting. And they never failed to have a big band precede them. And then when they got down there, all their friends and relatives would be there to say the last goodbyes.
I remember that.
Yeah.
It makes me cry just to think of it because they'd be coming down the company street and mothers with babies in their arms would be walking along and waving goodbye. And
You had a lot of chances to get into the camp too, or did you?
oh yeah,
What were some of your experiences here?
well, Major Abbott, who was the exchange officer, and his wife didn't have any children. And I was about 13 or 14, I guess, when I came out here. And he was really fond of me, so that I was invited out a lot. And one thing I did, he set up a booth for me in the main post exchange so I could sell bonds. And I can't remember how much I sold, but it was a lot. I was so proud of myself. So when I was out here selling bonds, I would see some of these things. And the other thing I remember is when Colonel Lawon, Zim Lawon, died, and that was very impressive because
Would he have been a commander here at the
yeah,
time?
he was the commander of the camp. He wasn't very old either, as I recall it. His death was quite unexpected, and it was very sad. But it was a typical military funeral. They had his coffin on the caisson, and they had the horse with the empty boots, and you know how they play that music, and I remember that. And it was interesting, real interesting, kind of for a young person. One thing I remember, they had a Greek photographer at the camp. He used to take, the soldiers would have their pictures taken. And I wish I could remember what his name was, but it was very difficult to pronounce. And he told me that if the next day when he came back, if I could pronounce his name, that he would take my picture. And I still have that picture. It was a studio photograph, with
He
his-
did take your picture?
Oh,
then?
yeah, he did for nothing and made some nice colored copies for me and everything. That's about it.
You got to know quite a few of the people as individuals here, like, soldiers who you'd see often and people who
Well,
work in your exchanges?
I got to know the people that my dad worked with, but, you know, I was only 14 years old, so my mother and dad were pretty protective. I didn't get to know any soldiers, no.
How many people would you say you had at one time working, say, an exchange?
Oh, I would say, in the main exchange or,
Well, say-
or all over?
No, just say the main exchange, just to say one of them.
Oh, I would say about 15.
And that was bigger than the others.
Yeah, that was a big exchange. We sold everything in there. We sold
And
all
normally-
kind of clothing, uniforms.
Beer?
Yeah.
Oh, beer?
Not in the main exchange.
That wasn't the main
No.
exchange? You had to get in the other ones.
No, that was just high-class merchandise, the main
But it was
exchange.
interesting because there was a lot of stuff that you couldn't get anyplace else, you
It
know,
was
and
just like
it
a
was
s-
restricted
We
too.
would sell like luggage and watches and jewelry, things like that.
It was a store for the GIs, in other words.
Oh, yeah,
Right?
it was restricted. I mean, you weren't, it wasn't open to just anybody.
Well, it was also for officers too. We sold a lot of officers' clothing. That's where they got their winter clothing from.
Okay, then what would be the difference to the other PXs, the other ones, the smaller ones?
Well, there really wasn't any difference between they were all, one was a duplicate of the other because we made up the shelving and the counters. They were all made up ahead of time. So all we had to do was would allocate an empty barracks to us, and we just get the trucks, get down and haul this stuff out of the warehouse and bring it up, and the carpenters would install it. They could do it in a few hours. They'd have it all ready to stock with merchandise.
You had a lot of German POWs at the camp too, didn't you, Daddy?
Oh yeah, we had, but what outstands in my mind mostly was the GI prisoners that came from all over the country. We used to go down to the spur at the station in the afternoon, and MPs would be coming in from all over the United States with prisoners, all handcuffed. And
They
then-
had a big stockade here for these?
Oh, yeah.
This
they
would
had a
be
big
soldiers would be-
stockade And had a lot of guards are walking the perimeter of the stockade.
Then what would they do with these people?
Well, they'd hold them there until they were ready for trial, and then they were sent out to wherever they were going to be tried. A lot of them went to Leavenworth. Those that had committed major crimes were sent to federal prisons.
I remember seeing the German POWs drilling. You know, they used to do that
Oh,
on their own. March all the time.
What kind of people was, in your opinion, what kind of people was the German prisoners? Were they happy people, sad people? Were they
No.
sad because they were here?
They at first were very arrogant, and my daughter told you, they went right through the same routine as they would if they were over in Germany. But after they were here a while and began to be well fed, and then their attitude changed, and we didn't run into any troubles at all with them after that. After a few months, we got so that they were employed in some of the exchanges, and particularly in the civilian mess. They waited on us at the tables in the civilian mess.
What did they like about our food which was different from theirs overseas?
Oh, they thought white bread was ice cream. They hadn't seen white bread in so many years, and any of our food, the meat, all the meat, they didn't get that stuff over there when they were on their way out.
What was so sad was, though, toward the end was the children.
Kids.
They were only 14 or 15 years old, the
Young
POWs.
people.
They were, you know, they'd be like babies. It was terrible. And old men. Of course, they seemed old to us at the time, but toward the end, it was children and old men. And they
Yeah,
were,
a lot
and
of old
the
men.
older ones were really pathetic. I mean, they were men that didn't want to be fighting. They didn't want to be here. They had just been dragged up from the street and brought over here.
Did you ever see, beside Germans, was there some other nationalities? You'd never see the Italians that was here?
Never.
Yeah, we saw, there were just small group of Italians, weren't there? It seems to me I remember them.
There were some here.
Yeah,
Just
but
wonder if
not
you ever
too
run
many,
across them.
yeah.
Some Italians?
Yes, there was.
Yeah,
I don't
just-
remember this.
I remember just a small group, I think, some Italians.
Mostly German prisoners.
But they were, they had camps up in the upper part of the state. A lot of people didn't know that. From Camp Reynolds, the
Oh,
exchanges.
yeah, we had up around Franklin, Warren, St. Mary's. We had a big camp up at St. Mary's.
There was one at Marionville too in Forest County.
POWs, uh-huh.
Okay, what did you sell in the PX? What kind of commodities?
Oh, we sold, first and foremost, we sold beer,
And what kind of beer was that?
3.2.
3.2.
You want me to advertise beer? We sold Carlings, red and black label. We sold Yinglings.
Did you ever get to know some of the people that brought the beer in?
Oh, yeah.
The distributors, where would they be from?
Uh,
Locally?
They were from Sharon, Farrell.
Well, could you remember some of their names?
Oh, the only ones I remember was Tony Manaka.
Tony Manaka.
Because he was at the camp all the time. Anyway,
He got to be a real friend of ours, you know. When we came back, of course this was off the,
And now,
when we came back here, we went to visit him.
now you're stirring my memories. I worked for Tony Manaka at this camp,
did you?
and I hauled a lot of your 3.2 beer up here.
Yeah.
And some of the names was on that beer, and some of the local breweries that a lot of people never heard of
No.
was Union Brew.
Iron
You remember?
City.
Well, Iron City, Manaka didn't sell the Iron City. He sold the Union Brew, Steel City out of Youngstown. Union Brew was out of Newcastle. Germantown out of Germantown, Pennsylvania. Rolling Rock out of Latrobe.
Yeah, I wish they were all
Darling's Black Label out of Cleveland. And Kohler's out of Erie.
Yeah.
Could you maybe, now most of the other stuff would have been sold by one of the other distributors. He had all the dispensing rights. He had the draft beer, in other words.
Yeah.
And the other one just had bottled beer. They sold a lot of it, didn't they?
Oh. I used to have representatives from the other beer distributors. They used to offer me money, offer me $75 a week to put their beer on top. These beer cases, you know, they were about this high and about that wide and about as long as these two tables. And then we'd stack the beer in there. And then a layer of ice and beer and ice and beer. And a lot of these companies would say, how about putting mine on top? I'll give you $75 a week to see that my beer is on the top. I used to tell them, all I'll promise you is that if you come in the exchange, your beer will be in the case. I can't tell you where it will be, but it will be there. But I'm not putting anybody's beer on top for money, for any kind of money.
Was it ever to a point where you sold everybody's beer, would sell out of everything?
Yeah,
A lot of times you did that?
oh yeah. A lot of times Tony would rush a load over. The same way with the soda companies. They would do the same thing. They'd offer me money to see that their soda was on the top.
Another big popular thing was with the soldiers. They liked ice cream, that Isley's ice cream from Youngstown. You sold a lot of that, didn't you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm the, so far as I know, the last surviving member of the Pennsylvania Railroad who was of the transfer in Greenville district. And I worked there, I think, from 1938 to around 1948 or 49. And primarily things started booming around here when they were building the Keystone Ordnance Works up in Meadville. And you sort of knew after that that something was going to happen. But believe me, we didn't know that Camp Reynolds was going to be, or Shenango Replacement Depot as it was called then, was going to be here. But all at once it was. It started, and our station in Greenville only had 2 personnel, the agent R.D. Boffman and myself, and we worked our tails off because Greenville had industries at that time that were all booming, and our railroad interchanged with the Erie Railroad down at Transfer here, and that would be taking in the Keystone Ordnance Works part. But then the Pennsylvania had the right-of-way here for the Shenango Replacement Depot. And overnight, seemingly, things just took off. You were going along peacefully at one time, and the next thing you know, there were reserve officers, regular Army officers coming in there wanting to know what was going on and why we didn't do this and why we didn't do that. Well, you don't talk to a big corporation like the Pennsylvania Railroad like do this overnight. We did get a good station out of it, but I remember one officer coming in there, and at that time we had the old pot-bellied stove in the waiting room. And he didn't know what that was. And we told him and showed him. He couldn't have that. We thought we had a brand new stove out of it anyway. But overnight it got real pathetic. People were coming in, women were coming in with young babies, and they didn't know why they were there, how they got there, where they were going. And it was just a 24-hour job. I mean, all the time to take care of those people. And the building down here, as I told George there, was Mellon Stewart had the general contract. They were out of Pittsburgh. And they built this place in seemingly nothing flat in about a year. And we had the troop movements. We, out of Greenville.
Don, did the first troops come into Greenville, or did they ship into Transfer? Or both places?
No, they brought them to Greenville first, and then they'd have to back them down. They never stopped to Transfer. They came on up, but they would go back.
That's how they got down to Transfer.
Then they put the sidings. They had the sidings in that went all through this end up where Westinghouse and all those buildings were up.
Did the Pensy put the sidings in for the Army, for the War Department?
Pensy put them in. And eventually they built that little station there, Victory, which, yeah, that's it.
Pick it up.
And,
Pick it up.
well, Cliff Moore, C.N. Moore was,
Show it, Don. It looks like it.
Was
Oh,
the,
yeah, we'll show it on.
Oh, okay, all right, we'll pick it up.
C.N. Moore was the agent of Transfer, and he was by himself. And if it hadn't been for the cadre of the Army and their trucks and so forth, that carload and carload and carload of things came in on the sidings there, and how they ever figured out who it went, where it went, and so forth is one of the mysteries of the world. But they got it all together and turned this old potato farm into a place larger than must have been as large as Sharon at that time, for near. It was personnel.
Probably larger than Sharon. They
Yeah.
eventually had 75,000 here.
Yeah.
Built for 90, and they ended up with 75,000.
Yeah, well, that's about what they had.
Sharon was probably in the population,
Yeah.
probably 20-some at the time.
There were people here from all over the country. No money. Lots of these women that were looking for their husbands or boyfriends or somebody. They'd get here and no way to get out. And the Red Cross, of course, and different organizations helped them that way, and I know that there's lots of times at night when after the last passenger train would go and we would like to close the station, it was just impossible. Those people had no place to stay, and you just had to leave them.
So a
Stay there.
lot of the holdovers stayed right near the
They-
station then, right?
Lots of times, they were right there, and
Did you really ever have any problems with that kind of a thing happening?
no, we didn't, because the MPs from the camp would police this area pretty good. And it was mostly women. It wasn't, because they didn't allow the soldiers out too much at the beginning. They were here to get processed and get out of here. This was a replacement depot. And I got to know quite a few of them, the officers and so forth, that you would naturally. And we had the travel orders from the War Department where these trains, 15, 20 carload trains.
Did you work right on the making the train loads up or
No, not
arranging the
no,
trains?
They made the trains up at down here at Reynolds, but we had the tickets and the transportation orders for them. You never told anybody where they were going. I've had a lot of fellows that I knew who just begged me to tell them where they were supposed to go. And finally, we hit on the idea, we'd say Pittsburgh. A lot of people didn't know where Pittsburgh was, and if they got the idea that it was this Pittsburgh down here, it wasn't. It was Pittsburgh, California, the demarcation point. That was, then you would ship trains, if they were going east, instead of running them right down the road here, Pittsburgh or somewhere, they'd run them clear up through Erie and down the main line through,
More or less backtracking them?
that's right. That way that, I guess they did that, thinking that maybe if anybody was spying, they wouldn't know where the trains were going, per se.
Don, there's some stories like the residents of old transfer down there that some of the trains would come in there that coach windows would be painted black. Is there any truth to
Oh,
that?
yes, lots of them are like that.
Well, what would be the reason?
Those were bringing in German
PWs?
prisoners, yeah, prisoners. of war.
They didn't paint them black for our troops so they wouldn't know where they were going.
Well, they might have put some on the same trains, but they would break that train up somewhere. They've often done that. Lots of
How
trains.
often would a train load, or what would be the greatest amount of trains that ever went out
One day?
one day?
Oh, I think maybe 7, 8.
And how many be approximately how many men on a
Well,
train?
it'd be
How many cars?
anywhere from 15 to 25 cars.
How many?
And they were all steam engines too, don't forget. There were no diesels in that
I
time.
wanted to point that out. They're all steam at that
They
time.
were all steam, and man, when those babies would pour the coal to it, that smoke would come out there. People didn't like that too well, because that would envelop the whole town. And, but that's the way it went anyhow. But,
How many people would be on it? How many people? could be
well,
on
those
a car?
train, each car would hold, I would say 70 to 80 people.
Yeah.
Then later on, did
And,
they pick them at this Victory Station and they used that
well,
instead of
after they
transfer?
got that, well, things were pretty well
Built in.
finished over and finished up by.
About what year frame of the year would that have been? 40,
Well,
late in
let's see,
43,
the war was
40,
over in
44.
45. It would be 44 probably.
44 before they got their own station.
Around 44.
And most of the other activity went through transfer.
Transfer
Greenville
in
transfer.
Greenville, yeah.
Okay.
I was city editor of the Greenville Record-Argus during the Camp Reynolds days, and I was there from day one until the camp ended. And I'd just like to say that I was pleased to be asked to write the Reynolds history in connection with the 50th anniversary celebration. I'll just share two brief stories with you. The first occurred even before the camp opened. We had heard that quite a number of federal surveyors were down at the camp scene, and so I was sent down to see what was going on. And I remember approaching the crew chief and saying, "What are you guys surveying for?" And his response, "Oh, about $4.50 an hour." And that was probably the shortest interview I ever had in my life. One other little story I'll share with you is an incident that took place to the end of the, near the end of the war. We were invited down by the camp's public relations officer one afternoon. As usual, we were not told what to expect. Just be there at a certain time. Well, we were ushered into one of the several camp theaters, rather large theater. And inside we were surprised to see several hundred German prisoners of war. The theater was darkened, and on the screen flashed pictures that will remain indelible in my memory forever. They were the first official Signal Corps photos of the German war atrocities. These were taken by the Signal Corps for the War Department in Washington. They were not intended for public consumption. And while I had heard about these atrocities, at that stage they had never been pictured. I don't remember any newspaper or newsreel pictures or anything like that. So I, as well as the others there, were really flabbergasted at what we saw. It's hard to describe it. The horrors, unbelievable. In fact, former President Reagan, in his autobiography, devotes a page and a half to this very film. And he saved a copy for himself to show to any doubters that these atrocities took place. The reaction on the part of the German POWs was tremendous. They were very agitated and loud and protesting. And of course, I spoke no German. I didn't know what was going on, but the man who sat next to me was a Greenville man who spoke German. And I said, "What's going on here?" He said, "They do not believe this. They believe these pictures are all propaganda. They are fake pictures. They did not believe that the Germans would do such a thing. It was inconceivable to them." And they were really wrought up. And as I said, I'll never forget those scenes as long as I live. And it was just a horrible, horrible thing, almost too horrible to describe. I think that there are a lot of things that happened over a 3-year period or so, but those are just a couple of the highlights, and be happy to share them with you. Are there any other questions that you might have?
You know, what did you hear? One of the big mysteries in the area, I guess, is information about the race riot and the conflicting reports.
Well, we heard reports, of course, of the race riot almost immediately. It took place one late afternoon and evening. A lot of civilian employees down there, and they brought back the word. But when we asked about it, we got what somebody called a snow job. The PR office didn't want to say much about it. Later, quite some time later, I wrote to the War Department and asked about it. I got no reply. I wrote probably 2 or 3 times and finally went to our congressman. And they sent a Xerox page from a book that someone had written about the treatment of Negroes in World War II. And it said that one soldier had been killed. Of course, I interviewed two men who were MPs down there. One said that he saw 2 killed, and the other worked later in the provost marshal's office, said that he understood the death toll was between 30 and 35. So I don't know. It was a hush-hush affair. And it was sort of a sad chapter, too, in the whole history of the camp.
Were there any famous personalities that did you get to see down there?
Oh yes, I got to see a number. The one that stands out in my memory was Wayne King. Again, we were ushered into an officers' club without any advance warning, and introduced to Wayne King, who was the Waltz King and one of the top big band leaders of his time. And he had just come from Alaska, and we talked at length. And then one of the oddities, back in the 1970s, he was in concert at Newcastle, and I went down to see him. And I went backstage at intermission and introduced myself, and I said, of course you wouldn't remember me, but I was at an army camp near Greenville and was introduced to you. And he said, oh, you mean the Shenango personnel replacement depot? I said, right. Now how the man knew that after all those years and all the camps he visited, I have no idea. He was there just a short while, and I think he organized 4 dance orchestras, and then moved on to some other camp. And of course I saw some boxing personalities and others. They had quite a parade of entertainers down there to keep the soldiers happy as possible. Most of the fellows were not there very long, maybe a week or so, and then they were sent to Europe.
I arrived by train up at transfer. There was about 65 of us on the train, and there were supposed to be trucks there, but there weren't. And we walked from transfer to the camp. And when we went into camp, the carpenters were still working there. They were up towards 20th Street, up in that area, still building, for several weeks after we got there. Well, it was all mud. The barracks had just finished. And they did give us bunks to sleep in and a place to eat. Well, a couple days later, they come in and screened us of what we were going to do in the camp, cooks, and so on. And I was assigned to the MPs because I had a police background in civilian life. So then I was shipped up to 10th Street. That's where, as you come into the main headquarters, you went down into the camp. At the corner of 10th and A Street, I was put in the barracks. And I stayed in that barracks, and I lived there all the 2 years that I was at the camp. Although I didn't always work in the MPs as such, first came the riots. I was in the bunkhouse about 7 or 8 o'clock at night, and they came in and they said, we had 2 fellows ride motorcycle around the camp. And the one little kid's name was Jonah. And he was a southerner. They had him stopped down at the Colored PX, or in that area.
What area would that have been streetwise?
7th. And 7th Street. And it came out later that they were questioning him that, they had some stuff in the colored or the black PX at 7th Street that they didn't have in the 10th Street PX, which was white. They had beer in both of them, 3-2 beer, but the blacks were wanting to know why the whites at 10th Street threw the blacks out, or told them, the southerners told them not to come back there. Well, Jonah was a southerner with a thick accent, Well, anyhow, somebody came in and said that they had Jonah trapped. And so, of course, we grabbed weapons and went. And I had a shotgun, and so I went down 7th Street, and Jonah says, I'm all right, just don't worry. And so he, with his motorcycle, went back up to the white section. Well, the sergeant in charge told me to go over to 7th and B Street, me and this kid Jackson. And we went over there, and what I heard was, they said, let's not let them white sons of bitches tell us when to go to bed. Let's get them. And in the meantime, they had broken in there, what do they call it? Where they kept their guns and clothing and all that, and they took out guns. So some of the blacks had guns, not very many, but they had. Well, somebody shot, I think it was a white, into the crowd of blacks. And that started it off. And then me and Jackson got down, there was a car near the intersection of 7th and D, and we got down underneath that car, and they started shooting at us, so we shot back. Now, from what I understand, most of the ones that were killed were inside their barracks, and the bullets penetrated the barracks and killed them. There was a few killed outside, but most of them were killed in the barracks. Well, the blacks, of course, scattered, so would I. They found them as far away as Pittsburgh. They just took off. The ones that didn't want any part of that, to get the hell out of there. Well, things got under control, and they come and got us. And a couple of days later, they called us to a court-martial hearing. And the board was sitting there was 6 or 7 officers, and they questioned how we got involved in this, how it started, where it ended, and so on. And from that day, after they talked to us individually, me first, then Jackson, and so on. I guess they talked to other ones too. But from that day on, I've never heard any more about it. Any inquiries you made to it about it, I don't know. It didn't happen, and so on. I do know that they shipped all the black people that were there out. No, not over 10 of them went to any one camp. They shipped them Philadelphia, California, so on. And the lieutenant who was in charge of the blacks, his name was Gooseman, Lieutenant Gooseman. I even talked to him later. Nothing. He wouldn't say anything. He didn't know. I guess they were told to keep it quiet and shut up and so on.
I would like to share with you some experiences I had many, many years back at Camp Reynolds as a very young individual, shining shoes at the camp. Back in the summer of 1944, we started to shine shoes, a bunch of the boys in Greenville down in the main part of town, and we found that the competition got too tough in that there were probably 25, 30 different boys shining shoes in all corners. So we wasn't making quite the money we thought we should. And we had a few individuals, adults in town, suggest that we get a ride or get away down to Camp Reynolds, and there'd be a lot more soldiers down there to shine shoes and more money to be made. So we had no way to get down there, no transportation. So we knew that the buses, the Army buses, would come in to Greenville every half hour on the hour also, and unload and load at the Riverview Hotel near the bridge in Greenville. So we asked the bus driver while he was waiting to load if there was a possibility that we 3 shoeshine boys could get a ride to the camp to do our business. And he assured us that wasn't possible and that civilians were not allowed to ride on the bus. It was strictly for military personnel. However, he got tired of us bugging him every day,
And we also promised to shine his shoes if he'd allow us to ride. So he said that he would drop us off at the main gate. We indeed could get on the buses, but we'd have to go to the back of the bus. After the bus was loaded, if room, we'd go back to the back and sit. So we did this, and we'd get down, he'd drop us off at the main gate, and then the bus would go on in the camp. And we found that out at the main gate, why the business wasn't to be had, and that the soldiers were already in and out in vehicles, and not too many walked in and out of there. So we asked the driver a few days later if it'd be possible that he could go ahead and take a chance and take us down into camp. And he was afraid that he would lose his job if he got caught. And we assured him that they wouldn't see us, or wouldn't tell him how we got in there. So he made up a plan that when we got near the main gate, he would have us sit down in the back of the bus, lay down, get our heads down, and when he'd go in the gate, he'd give us a signal to drop our heads, and we did, and the MPs would flag them on through. And once inside the military installation, why, the MPs didn't bother us. They allowed us in there without any ID and so on. And so our business really flourished at that point in time. Lots of dimes were to be made, shining shoes. Here with this box that I've had since made in 1944 by an older brother. And this belt on it is the original belt given to me by a soldier down at the camp. And I cut the buckle off and had it attached here, as you can see, where you carry it over your shoulder. Inside the box is one of the original brushes that I used down at the camp. So that there is, close to 50 years old, that brush. And many of GI's boots and shoes were put on that box at 10 cents a shine. We'd yell out, "Shoe shine, free brush off." And probably toward the middle of the month, when the GIs didn't have much money with them, they'd spent all their money, why, they would take us up on the free brush off. But during the end of the month, when they were paid, why, a lot of them would give us 50 cents a shine or so on. The most I ever remember of picking up shining shoes was a $5 bill gained by a GI who was very generous. I assume he was generous. I don't know that he was all boozed up, but he gave me a $5 bill. I do remember that. Many thoughts about the box is, I've often wondered as I look at it, just how many GIs had put their foot on that box that left Camp Reynolds and went to Europe that never returned. I've thought about that many times. However, I made a lot of money with that box. It's still pretty solid, as you can see, and it's a real keepsake. My mother stored it over the years in the garage and gave it to my son here just a few years back, and I told him various stories about the camp. While we were down in the camp, not only did we shine shoes there, we would go to the mess hall and we would ask the cooks if we were allowed to eat our meals in there. And he said that after all the GIs were through eating, and the American prisoner war, these were the guys that, American prisoners, these were the guys who went AWOL in that. They weren't the German prisoner wars eating in the camp. After they were allowed to go through and eat, then he let us kids come in. However, we weren't allowed to take our business inside the mess hall. We had to leave our boxes outside. So what we did, we'd ask the guards who were guarding these prisoners while they were eating if they would watch our box for us, and we'd shine their shoes for them, and they did. And we didn't have to worry about anyone stealing our box or a polish or anything. I do recall going in the mess hall door, a real huge, large sign that indicated, "Take all you want, but eat all you take." And I was always afraid that if I didn't clean my tray up, I didn't know what they'd do, whether they'd lock us up or something, going through my mind. So we ate everything we could get on our tray, believe me. Occasionally, we would sneak into the theaters down there. Again, we weren't allowed in that. It was for military personnel only. However, when they would flock out of the theaters, we'd see an open door, we'd slide in for the next show. And it was a real experience for young kids at that point in time. I do recall that in the summer of '44 and the fall of '44, in 1945, when the war was coming to an end in that summer, the camp was still, of course, intact and operating. Not nearly as many personnel there. Why, business did start to dwindle some, but I made enough money them 2 summers that I bought all my school clothing with it and so on. And I probably, percentage-wise back then, made more money what I did the last few years, if you look at it on a percentage basis. But it was a real experience. The GIs were very, very good people. Never worried about anybody bothering us, stealing money off of us or anything like that. Never give us any trouble, and really treated us good. I made a lot of friends. Being that young, though, I just don't recall, of too many of them ever coming back in the area that I recognize or anything like that. But it was a real experience.
And I worked at Camp Reynolds, or Shenango Replacement Depot. I started right when I got out of high school in 1943. It was in March 1943. And I worked until the end of August 1945, so it was about 2.5 years.
You worked there 2 years then?
Over about 2.5.
I didn't realize
Till
you
the
worked
camp
there then.
went out.
Okay, so you quit, or you left when the camp left.
Really. I mean, wasn't completely closed, but just about.
Well, they deactivated, but they still had some prisons here.
Yeah.
And why don't you just tell where you worked at and some of the things you did there to get rolling?
I worked at the post office down there. Really, they called it the postal directory. I was hired as a clerk typist, and I did typing. But then I worked in the postal directory, and what they did was when the soldiers went overseas, they changed their address to APO numbers. So we had to put the APO numbers on the letters that came to the camp for the soldiers that had been shipped out. And we all had a letter. This room was like a great big building, long building. And it had rows of tables, and us girls sat at the tables. There were quite a few girls. I really don't know how many. Probably, I'm just guessing 30, maybe.
Oh, really?
Or whatever, 25 or 30, whatever. And we all had a letter, and my letter was R. And we had a index box with all the soldiers that began, like I had all the ones that their last name began with R. And then when the letters would come in for them, I'd put on their APO numbers, and then the ones that were shipped out. We didn't have anything to do with the other ones that came in for them that were stationed at Camp Reynolds.
Really?
I say that we always knew when the men were going, we would hear the band playing. I think this is one thing that is outstanding to me. We'd hear the band playing, and we'd look out the window, and there'd be hundreds, maybe 1,000 men marching down behind the band. They were going behind the band. They were going to be shipped out down to the train station.
Heading down to 50 Station.
And we always felt sad because we knew some of them wouldn't come back. Some of us would cry. Then the next
What
day
would be the most in one day you might have seen?
Gosh, I don't know. And like it wouldn't be every day, but I don't know.
Fairly often.
Yeah, maybe 2 or 3 times a week or something.
The person we just interviewed said that at one time there was as high as 7 trains in one day.
Oh, really? Oh, I don't remember
Maybe that refreshes your memory.
I just know, well, I know we heard it often, but I just can't remember how often we did hear it. But we always knew, and then the next day they'd pull all their cards, the ones that went, and they'd give them to us, and then they had to be typed, their address changed on them. And I helped do that, and then they'd bring it to the postal directory part, and we'd put their new addresses on.
So once they left, then it became your department, basically,
Yeah.
to start.
And Captain Taylor was our head man.
Taylor?
I worked at the postal directory for about, over a year, or most of the time that I worked down there. And then the last part, they were starting to lay off, so they laid off almost all of us. Well, they did really lay us all off. So I had, it went by your ratings. So the ones that had the real good ratings stayed the longest.
Oh, yeah?
So then I went to the personnel office for maybe a couple months, and I typed there. And then for the rest of the time, about 6 months before they closed it, I went up to the hospital post office, and I worked up there at that post office, and I really liked it up there. I liked it everywhere, but it was real nice. It was real small, and just, the meal for the men that worked up there, and the patients, and all this and that, I came in there. And I would give out meal, sort it, and then give it out when they came. And I had to pick up the mail. And I'd go down to a day room, and pick it up there. They had like a mailbox there. And then in these big corridors that connected all these different places, there would be mailboxes in there to pick up. I had to go. Well, sometimes I would see a POW mopping or sweeping, and I was scared. You know, I just felt real uneasy. He was probably scared too. But they never said anything or did anything or anything like that. But that's one thing I have up there. That and I was there when President Roosevelt died. I was working up there, and we observed a minute of silence.
Another good memory you had when you and Mr. Haycock, prisoners of war. There was do you remember that story? Of course,
Well, I remember bringing the shotgun, but I don't remember a whole lot about it.
But that story there, I guess,
I remember that
there was
story.
a couple officers stationed over here. They had the rooms up here at the neighbors on top of the hill. And anyway, this one evening, they had a couple of these prisoners of war. We got a Jeep to run them up to the house up here. And this old dirt road, the ditches used to be pretty wicked. And anyway, on the way back, these two prisoners of war, they ended up in a ditch. So Mr. Haycock lives right next door here. They stopped there, went to the door, wanted to see if he had a tractor to pull them out of the ditch. See? So anyway, before it was over, my dad got the shotgun. He had the an old single barrel 16 gauge shotgun. And he and Mr. Haycock, anyway, these two prisoners of war, they pulled them out of the ditch. And when they was hooking them up on Dad, you laid the shotgun down across the fender of the car or something like that. You know, he was the guard. Dad was the guard. He laid the shotgun down. But they were friendly prisoners of war, so there was no problem.
The Italian, Germans?
They were Germans.
Germans.
I remember that because we were just kids, and Dad, this knock came to the back door, and my sister, who's over here somewhere, I don't know where Mom was. It was just you and myself and Marge there, and you came back in and you said, "You girls lock the door, don't come out, don't do anything until I come back." And you took the gun and left, and you didn't tell us what was going on until you came back. And he said, "Oh, there was two prisoners of war in a ditch up here on the hill."
Was you pretty scared?
Yeah. And then they said they watched them till they went clear back, like down this road and up to the hospital, because the prisoners were afraid if they didn't get back at a certain time, they'd be put in the black box. So that must have been their punishment if they didn't get back there in time.
And another time of those prisoners of war, there was, as I recall, there was 3 or 4 of them must have walked away from camp. And anyway, I guess once they got away from camp, there was no place to go. So they all went back to camp, but one fell off. And the next morning, while I was in the barn, Dad was, I think at that time you'd gone back to work the steel car, but I was in the barn doing the chores, doing the milking. And I heard the barn door open, and I just thought, well, it was before Dad went to work, he'd just come over and check on things. So I didn't even turn around. Well, pretty soon I heard the voice. It was a strange voice. I turned around, and here was half a dozen MPs getting in there. They had their rifles and everything. And this one PW hadn't returned to camp, and they was out looking, and they wanted to search the barn and all the outbuildings that were on the farm looking for him. Of course, they didn't turn him up, but later that same afternoon, as I recall, down along the river, these people from Sharon had a cottage. And they come out to their cottage that afternoon, and anyway, when they got out, they had a dog with them, and the dog, he went up to the cottage and got the raising cane and barking and this and that, and they thought, well, it was the groundhog was under the building. But anyway, letting old Lenny, he went over and got down his hands and knees and looked under the cottage, and here was this prisoner of war, the one that hadn't returned to camp. He was hiding under their cottage there, so they got him. I guess he was afraid if he went back he might get shot or something, so he was hiding up. So,
They never helped or anything on your farm out here? They didn't,
no, they didn't help. But,
what was the address about that time? Could that have been RD3 Greenville here?
RD5, RD5 is it?
RD5, I think.
RD5.
Alright.
RD5.
We got a couple officers RD3 here.
No.
I'm going through one of the old phone books.
RD3, let's see, up at the top of the hill, was that Greenville or address up there at the top of the hill? I guess it would be on this, yeah, it'd still be. But the RD5 is our address down here.
They delivered the mail, the horse and buggy at that time.
Yeah. Well, and then talking about And the night of the riot over here, or the afternoon or evening, whenever that was. Why, of course, at that time, I guess I was about, well, when they built the camp, I was 15 years old. And,
Did you used to go over to the camp, sneak in?
oh yeah, well, they let us in. You got acquainted with
You buy stuff out of the PX?
Oh yeah, we used to go to the movies. Go to the PX, go to the movies. Sunday afternoon, a bunch of us boys, we'd always go over there every Sunday afternoon to one of the gymnasiums, and we'd get in a pickup basketball game with the soldiers. And then after I became 16 and was old enough to drive, why, every once in a while I'd take the old 35 Chevrolet and I'd go to camp. And as I recall, the speed limit on most of the streets was like 15 miles an hour. You know, being a 16-year-old kid, I had foot was a little heavier than that. And 3 or 4 different times I remember where I'd get stopped for speeding and they'd kick me off, send me home.
Did Mother know that?
No, Mother, Dad, no one knew that,
No one knew
but the MPs and myself.
Tell them about the riot.
Well, that now you're the riot, or I'd be down the neighbors, and I was coming home on my bicycle. And man, all heck broke loose over there. There was sirens and shooting. I don't know how many shots there. I thought the war came to Pymatuning Township, believe me. But anyway, I was down Hamburg Road there, and I come up there at the crossroads, well, I just turned, and up through the covered bridge I went on that bicycle as hard as I could pedal. And I went up over the knob, and just right up the top was where the stockade was, and there was a guardhouse there. Anyway, I went up through there, and they had the lights. It was just dusk. They hit me in the face with those lights, and that guy in the guardhouse, he seen me. And his English wasn't really, well, it was very understandable, but he told me that so-and-so kid should turn that bicycle around and get out of here. And I understood it very plainly. He didn't have to tell me the second time. I just spun that bicycle around, right back down through the covered bridge.
You mentioned
down here in the fields in the summertime, and, plowing or cultivating, corn, whatever it might be, you know, and he'd be, turn around, and here come a soldier boy walking out across the field, you know. And it'd be a country boy, and he'd be homesick. So he'd want to get on the tractor and go for rides. Some of them want to drive the tractor, so I had lots of help. And then down here in Dad's farm too, there was 2 wells. And they had billing, the pump houses we call them. And they'd have guards on the pump houses. And Mom used to bake bread and cookies and that, and we'd take it down and feed the guards. And she'd invite them up for dinner or supper, you know, and we always had, was always having soldiers in to eat.
They like the fresh milk off the farm.
Oh yeah, and
Did they ever give you any problems here?
never.
No.
And the only, and at night, it may be 10 o'clock at night, maybe 2 o'clock in the morning, they used to take them for marches out past the house down. Of course, it was a gravel road. And at 2 o'clock at night, all they had that crunch, you know, there wouldn't be a sound, but they'd wake you up. And I would,
Full-filled packs?
full-filled packs, and they'd be out marching. And they'd wake you up in the middle of the night, but there'd never be a sound on that march, and everybody would be quiet. Now in the daytime,
I forgot about that.
on our
sound.
marches, they'd be having a little bit of fun, and every once in a while, why, if there wasn't too many guards out with them, why, in the old pig lot down there was a lot of elderberry bushes, and every once in a while, you'd be sitting watching, why, one of those boys would fall out of rank and dive in under the bushes, and lay under there till they came back. But another memory too is when of course there was trains coming and going over here constantly. That was, to me, it was fascinating. But every once in a while, when they,
Did you see the fellows going by?
but when they was hauling it, yeah, when they was leaving the camp, they was headed for overseas.
When we were hearing reports when they shipped them out, there was always a band for every time you shipped it. Could you hear the band
You
from
could hear a
here?
band playing. And then, of course, those old steam locomotives, and every once in a while, the engineer on there, why, he would, when they would leave, he'd lay on the whistle. And he would just lay on that whistle till they got the other side of Greenville.
I can remember
And
that.
that, you knew that those boys was headed for overseas.
What was the song the guy said he played when the war was over?
All Star Spangled Banner.
Yeah, he played the Star Spangled Banner on his whistle.
On the whistle.
When they had the war was over
No.
in Greenville.
But you usually knew when there was a,
I've been the same guy.
it could have been, but I just say, you know, when there was trains coming and going all the time, but when they was leaving over there, as a rule, they'd lay on that whistle, and you knew that that was a trainload of boys headed for overseas.
It had a sad, mournful
Yeah, and
sound. And then the
Everybody-
drums,
Steam locomotives taking off that truck.
Everybody said that's the same report. Everybody that witnessed it, that was a sad affair.
guess like the other when I was just a kid, I had the cultivators on the tractor. Of course, they stuck out pretty wide in the back behind the tractor. Narrow dirt road down there, but here come a bunch of soldiers boys. They was out on their hike or on their march. And I was headed for the field, and I had her in high gear. And I never backed off on it. I scattered soldiers. Well, Second Louis was in charge of him. He was yelling and screaming at me, and I never backed off the throttle. And I had soldiers all over the place down there. They thought it was great. They was hooping and hollering and whistling. And the officer in charge, he didn't think it was very funny.
I can remember the MPs, sometimes it was our own boys that were evidently prisoners or in trouble of some kind, and the MPs would run them down the road. Mom used to get so furious because, there was our pure, innocent little soldier boys, but they'd done something. But anyhow, the MPs would be in the Jeep, and the guys would be running, and they'd really take them down those roads, and it was kind of sad to see, because you thought they were running a little bit too fast, maybe.
You ever get to know any of them MPs that some of them were stationed quite a while?
I can't remember.
Not really personally, no. I never got.
Bill Tomac, you know who he was?
Oh yeah.
Bill was stationed there.
Bill was a policeman in Greenville for.
Mm-hmm.
But my mother, she used to get awful mad at the United States Army when they bring some of those prisoners of war on a march or a hike, for exercise. They'd have one American soldier in front and one behind, and they'd be 100, 200 prisoners, and they'd be marching down the road. And anyway, down there in the bottom, this one evening, was one American prisoner and 3 guards, and they had him running. And anyway, right down below the barn down there, short ways, somebody, I don't know what happened, but he tripped and fell, see, and he wouldn't get up. So here's these 3 guys with their rifles, and they was nudging him with their rifle butts, see. And she was very put out over that. She said 200 prisoners of war and 2 guards, 1 American prisoner and 3 guards, and they're beating him with their rifle butts, see. And I said, well, Mother, that just goes to prove you that 1 American is tougher than 200 Germans, see.
Shades of LA,
But she didn't believe it either.
I started working here at Camp Reynolds in June 1944, and I worked as a secretary to a battalion major, and I worked there.
Do you remember his name, Joyce?
No, I don't. And I worked for him. In fact, I was working for him at the time that I met my future husband, Hilbert. And I worked there until the camp started to close, and they started to consolidate offices and so on and so forth. And the men, when they started to close the camp, they started closing it from the upper end up here. So from that office, I was moved down to an office which was called Blood Typing and Immunization Building. And I worked in that office, which was like mostly all women, that we took care of the records of the soldiers. But in this building was like divided in half, and the men would file through on this side of the building for their shots, and we worked on this side.
Was this for when they would ship them out?
Yes, this was when they were getting ready to be shipped out. And almost daily, we would hear thumps over there, that the guys, as they was getting their shots, just couldn't take it, and they would just thump to the floor. But anyhow, the thing that I remember most about working at that building, it was right on what we called A Street then, which is now Arlington Drive. But there was just be thousands and thousands of men trooped past on their way down to the train station. And I know often us girls would go out there on our lunch hours and watch the troops go by, and it was so sad.
They had the band and everything when they marched?
Yes, they had some band with them, or some drums, and the flags were always in front of each little battalion. Seemed like they had their little flag. And it was just heart-wrenching because the guest house was down in that area, and quite often there would be wives and mothers and watching their soldiers move out. And just to see them going with their full filled packs, and just knowing they were going overseas and might not come back, it really never left me that feeling of these thousands and thousands of thousands of men that were marching off to war. And of course, trains just came in, like down there at Transfer. Our whole lunch period, whatever it was at that time, we could just stand there and watch, and women along the streets crying, and of course the men never allowed to leave their eyes, you know, straight ahead on they marched. And it was heart-rending, it really was. And I just thought it was, as I look back, it was a time in my life that I really felt sorry for these young men going, you know, that it was, because we all knew that right from here they were going to deembarkation points and was going overseas. But anyhow, from there, then when that office closed, and Camp Reynolds had started to proceed in the closing. And then I was moved up to the hospital area, and I worked in the office up there. And the hospital office was the last, I think, to close at Reynolds. And so I worked up there almost to the end. And then that summer, 1946 is when Hilbert came back. And that summer, we both were employed at tearing the camp down. That was in 1946. I was working for one contractor, and you were working for another one.
Who worked, Trumbull was one of them.
It was who I worked for. I was this.
I don't remember who I
Dick Neff would have been the overseer of the Trumbull.
No, then it wasn't Trumbull. Was there a Robinson?
There could have been, but
Okay.
Dick Neff was in charge of that's.
Dick Neff was not my boss.
No, he was in charge of the whole project.
Oh.
He was the guy that they hired, Trumbull hired, to come in, tear these buildings down, revamp them, and send them to the colleges as they did. Wilmington,
I know.
Edinburgh, Ganning, some over in the
Where
high
I
side.
worked for, I knew they all went to Philadelphia because
Some went there too.
the construction man that I was his secretary. And then I was the timekeeper then too. I was secretary and timekeeper. But Hilbert, do you remember, you don't remember the name of the company that you worked for either?
This Carl Goodrich ringing.
It runs in my mind that it was Robinson.
I mean, but the guy that was in charge of, where was that building at? They reconstructed them buildings. That was any particular place at the camp. When they took them, they tore them down. They took them to like an assembly building where they reconstructed them and they shipped them out in pieces.
Now that I'm not familiar
What
with.
about
I
where
didn't-
Mercer Paper Tube is today? They call
No, the headquarters for my company was over on Brentwood Drive.
Okay, well this is one of the big ones was over there where they took the buildings in pieces. And Carl Goodrich, he was the local man here. He was in charge of doing all. He was this wonderful carpenter. And he had like 300 to 400 guys working for him. They rebuilt them, partially assembled them, tore them apart, and shipped them out in pieces to the college and so forth.
Well, where the company I worked for, we would cut them in sections, and where they could cut right alongside of a 2x4, and then they would wherever they assembled them before, we would put a splice of 2x4 on the end of it. See, and then when they put them back together, they could take them and match them right together, as like a scab. Put a scab on them. We would cut them in sections, 8-foot sections, because these were loaded right on semi trucks. They were shipped. Now there's two homes right down here is made out of barracks yet, out of old barracks.
That was one barracks cut in half.
Right. That's
This house
Gurney's.
next, this house next
I
door, it's
remember
part
that.
of the barracks.
Yeah, this here place right here.
This place next
Yeah,
door.
this over
Yeah,
there.
right.
And my son's house is part of a barracks, and the property that sits right in front of him is part of a barracks.
Right.
But they had cut them in sections. You can see them today in the attic, you know, that how they spliced them together. Then they put a scab in there and nailed the roof back on in the wall.
After they were done with the companies, they must have sold to individuals then.
Because we
You know.
lived in one.
Well, that's right, your house was a,
I guess it was a half one or
That's right.
whatever, but it was.
What the government was
Other than
trying to
it-
do is recover some of the money they initially put into it, and that's what they was trying to do.
That's what they were doing.
They said their goal was try to attain around 300,000 out of this.
So Hilbert, when you come in to camp, where did you come from to get to
Yeah, you ever
Camp
tell
Reynolds?
them about you?
Well, I took my training in Bend, Oregon, and engineer. And then from there, when after finished training, I went to Camp Beale, California. And then half the company went here to Reynolds, and I went to Camp Beale, California, and I was there 6.5 weeks waiting for shipment. And what they'd done, they turned around, the people that was here at Reynolds, they shipped them to the Pacific, and they shipped me up here and then to the,
You're half of the company, you mean, not just
Yeah.
you. You're half of the
my
company.
half of the company, and
That
then they
was in-
shipped me to the European theater.
How long were you at Camp Reynolds here?
About 3.5 weeks.
3.5 weeks.
Yeah.
Now, when you left, did you know where you were going to?
Here,
Yeah, when you
yeah,
when you
yeah. Because we went to New York there, and we was there for a few days, and then we got on the boat to Queen Mary. And it just that morning, they had in the newspaper that the Queen Mary was sunk. And here it said in the harbor of New York City there, and there's where we got onto. There were 30,000 soldiers on that boat that ship, when we left New York Harbor. We went out at night. We went in loaded during that day, early morning, and all day, and then we left at night.